We're back after that interlude for another analysis of Beyond Good and Evil, and we're starting in on Part 5, The Natural History of Morals, on section number 186. And if you notice that we've jumped way ahead in aphorism or section numbers since last time, it's because those epigrams and interludes are really short, and you can go through quite a lot of them, and now it feels like we've covered a lot of ground all of a sudden, even though we're about halfway through the book. So let's get into it. Here is section 187. Quote, "The moral sentiment in Europe today is as refined, old, diverse, irritable, and subtle as the science of morals that accompanies it is still young, raw, clumsy, and butterfingered, an attractive contrast that occasionally even becomes visible and incarnate in the person of a moralist. Even the term science of morals is much too arrogant considering what it designates and offends good taste, which always prefers more modest terms." End quote. So right here at the beginning, we have Nietzsche contrasting our moral sentiments, which are a very old thing, which, the way he describes it, it's something that's very deep within the European psyche. And this is in contrast to something like a science of morals is young and clumsy. And that these two aspects, one's moral sentimentality, their feelings, which could be very strong because they're very well developed, and it's something with a great deal of subtlety and complexity within the European psyche, can even accompany somebody with this sort of modern intellect, which is capable of looking inward in a psychological way. And we can adduce that Nietzsche would think that this science of morals would be under the umbrella of this new method of psychology, studying the human mind. To continue with the passage, quote, "One should own up in all strictness to what is necessary here for a long time to come, to what alone is justified so far, to collect material, to conceptualize and arrange a vast realm of subtle feelings of value and differences of value, which are alive, grow, beget, and perish, and perhaps attempts to present vividly some of the more frequent and recurring forms of such living crystallizations, all to prepare a typology of morals," end quote. And what this passage reminds of so far is Nietzsche's Chemistry of Concepts and Feelings, which is sort of an early proto-attempt at the same thing, of the science of morals, because he's found something that is more primary or more primordial, more fundamental than concepts or feelings, right? Feelings we might correlate with sensation, the direct, immediate sensation of the world, and concepts with the intermediary representation of the world, that there is something beneath either one, which are values. Values being, in some sense, equated with or synonymous with our drives. We might say that each one of our drives or our underlying impulses or desires has its own form of valuation. And so what a science of morals would do would be to go down to that level, and he says to conceptualize and arrange a vast realm of subtle feelings of value and differences of value. And he points out that these are alive, just as we are alive, that this is it's a vivisectory process, in some sense, because we are attempting to look in on something living and get into its guts and see how it operates. Okay, we'll continue. Quote, "To be sure, so far one has not been so modest. With a stiff seriousness that inspires laughter, all our philosophers demanded something far more exalted, presumptuous, and solemn from themselves as soon as they approached the study of morality. They wanted to supply a rational foundation for morality, and every philosopher so far has believed that he has provided such a foundation. Morality itself, however, was accepted as given. How remote from their clumsy pride was that task which they considered insignificant and left in dust and must, the task of description, although the subtlest fingers and senses can scarcely be subtle enough for it. Just because our moral philosophers knew the facts of morality only very approximately in arbitrary extracts or in accidental epitomes, for example, as the morality of their environment, their class, their church, the spirit of their time, their climate, and part of the world, just because they were poorly informed and not even very curious about different people, times, and past ages, they never laid eyes on the real problems of morality, for these emerge only when we compare many moralities. In all science of morals, so far one thing was lacking, strange as it may sound: the problem of morality itself. What was lacking was any suspicion that there was something problematic here. What the philosophers call a rational foundation for morality, and tried to supply, was, seen in the right light, merely a scholarly variation of the common faith in the prevalent morality, a new means of expression for this faith, and thus just another fact within a particular morality. Indeed, in the last analysis, a kind of denial that this morality might ever be considered problematic, certainly the very opposite of an examination, analysis, questioning, and vivisection of this very faith. End quote. And so, what the philosophers called their rational foundation was simply a different type of expression of the common folk wisdom of morality. So early in the passage, Nietzsche sets up this idea that there may have been people with something approximating a will to truth, attempting, or having the thought of attempting, a scientific analysis of morality, bringing the light of their reason to understand morality. But what they all end up doing is simply supplying a post-hoc rationalization for why the common faith, the conventional set of moral doctrines, they always end up justifying this as correct. That's what their reason discovers. Why would this be? Well, because their moral sentimentality can coexist with this urge to be scientific in this post-enlightenment way. And so what happens is the same faith, which springs from the moral sentimentality that's very old and inculcated within ourselves, simply expressed in a new language. This is what the Enlightenment does, is to launder these old superstitions, like the soul superstition in the case of Descartes, into now an ego superstition, or to launder, morality as handed down by a divine lawgiver into something that one can determine from the proper application of their intellect to the questions of how they ought to use their free will in the world in the most rational possible way. This is, in so many words, like the project of Kant. That would be the obvious place to go with this. But there is something much broader than simply an attack on moral realism or something of that nature here. Because Nietzsche says that morality itself is problematic. And so even though there have been these other attempts at crafting morality that don't perhaps depend on you to believe that there are objective moral facts in the world, but perhaps the appeals of utilitarians being perhaps the strongest strain of consequentialist moral thought, or just appealing to some other argument, any philosophical attempt to outline an ethical code of behavior fails to treat morality itself as something problematic, or we might say to put a question mark behind it and raise the issue of why we might be moral beings at all, or in the first place, and to treat morality as something that humans did truly invent, and which is therefore contingent upon us and contingent upon the time and place and perspective at which we live and exist. And from all of these considerations, to regard as at least questionable the idea that we even should be attempting to engage in something like a rational justification of morality or a rational argument for the sake of a morality. What if such a prospect is entirely absurd from the beginning? And Nietzsche says that this problem will become apparent when one compares many moralities, and so in some sense we're pointing to another thing in Human All Too Human, that congenital defect of philosophers, that they take what is near to them in their particular time and place and universalize it. And that now, in this age of comparisons, This is one of the things that has broken open this new science of psychology, and made it possible. So we'll continue with the passage. Quote, "Listen, for example, with what almost venerable innocence Schopenhauer still described his task, and then draw your conclusions about the scientific standing of a science whose ultimate masters still talk like children and little old women." And now Nietzsche is going to quote from Schopenhauer here. Quote, "The principle, the fundamental proposition on whose contents all moral philosophers are really agreed, hurt no one, rather help all as much as you can. That is really the proposition for which all moralists endeavor to find the rational foundation, the real basis of ethics, for which one has been looking for thousands of years, as for the philosopher's stone." End quote. So that's Schopenhauer talking, that Nietzsche just quoted, and we will go back now to Nietzsche, who finishes out the passage like this, quote, "The difficulty of providing a rational foundation for the principle cited may indeed be great. As is well known, Schopenhauer did not succeed either. And whoever has once felt deeply how insipidly false and sentimental this principle is, in a world whose essence is will to power, may allow himself to be reminded that Schopenhauer, though a pessimist, really played the flute. Every day after dinner, one should read his biography on that. And, incidentally, a pessimist, one who denies God and the world, but comes to a stop before morality, who affirms morality and plays the flute. The laide neminem morality. What? Is that really a pessimist?" End quote. And that last phrase, the laide neminem morality, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong because Latin is famously difficult to pronounce. That's from the Latin phrase, the translation of which is what I read, hurt no one, rather help all as much as you can. That's one of those. Nietzsche says, Schopenhauer still speaks like a child or an old woman. I think part of what he's getting to there is that it really reminds me of one of the common sort of Chinese moral sayings in the Yin Che Wen, which is a little virtue ethics tract, I suppose you could say. That was very common in China, especially pre-communist revolution, that every household had a copy of. But one of the little moral dictums in that tract is, I believe it's a paraphrase of a Buddhist sutra, avoid that which is evil and do that which is good. Right? So, great advice, right? I'm sure most people on the, sort of any kind of course of self-improvement or moral improvement in their lives their question would be, well, how? Yeah, I know that, but how do I do it? Right? And that how is you could elaborate on that into entire volumes, and you could sort of say that that's what religions by and large are these, holy books are these long moral elaborations on how you're supposed to carry out the good life. But of course, Nietzsche points out that, Schopenhauer denies God, he denies the world, he comes to a stop, though, before morality. Schopenhauer is therefore, again, an example of Nietzsche's, his, I don't want to call him a whipping boy at this point, but someone Nietzsche has used as an example of past errors so often in this particular book, Beyond Good and Evil, but partially because he gets 2/3 of the way there, right? He got Nietzsche 2/3 of the way there. But it's that last snare, right? Morality, that Schopenhauer doesn't dare challenge, so that he can then stand for this figure who has that, what would you say, scientific inclination, philosophical inclination to look at the world in this rational way, is a supposed or explicit goal of his, we might say. But deep down, the moral sentiments of the European psyche are so deep that he cannot get over that last snare of morality. And so, that's the way Nietzsche is conceptualizing his project here. It's he is the one who gets over that final snare. And that's why he lays such a high premium or high importance on that aspect of, for example, his character Zarathustra, calling him, the annihilator of morality, that Dionysian monster who dared to annihilate the common morality. That's, of course, the significance behind the name Zarathustra. That, historically speaking, as the first figure to divide the world into metaphysical categories of good and evil, Zarathustra, as the one who has been making the mistake the longest, would be the first one to wake up to the fact that it is a mistake, and then to attack and collapse that division between good and evil, which is, of course, the task of this entire book. And so I guess to the summary of this first section is Nietzsche returning us in his study of morals. We're about to embark now on the section of the book that is an attempt at a natural history of morals, so to look at morality as a natural phenomenon, something created by a natural being, something that evolved and came out of nature, rather than a being that was created or exists in some sort of like transcendental or idealistic sense. And that we're doing this from the standpoint of the immoralist. And that this is very important because morality itself is a problem, which becomes clear when you contrast multiple moralities. It will never remain clear to you so long as you remain within the framework of a particular morality. But if you do step outside of your individual morality, this is itself a sort of a challenge often to the moral tenets of your society, your religion, or whatever it may be. Which is why most people don't do this, and it is the most deeply inculcated thing within us. This is what we have working against us in establishing the science of morals. But if you are able to go and sound your, hammer against the various idols as though it were a tuning fork, and to really engage in that process of vivisection, you can see how problematic and questionable the very notion of morality can be. And that the implication then is that one has to be an immoralist in order to study morality honestly. And with that, we'll move on to section 187. Quote, "Even apart from the value of such claims as there is a categorical imperative in us, one can still always ask, what does such a claim tell us about the man who makes it? There are moralities which are meant to justify their creator before others. Other moralities are meant to calm him and lead him to be satisfied with himself. With yet others, he wants to crucify himself and humiliate himself. With others, he wants to wreak revenge. With others, conceal himself. With others, transfigure himself and place himself way up at a distance. This morality is used by its creator to forget, that one to have others forget him or something about him. Some moralists want to vent their power and creative whims on humanity. Some others, perhaps including Kant, suggest with their morality, what deserves respect in me is that I can obey, and you ought not to be different from me. In short, moralities are also merely a sign language of the affects." End quote. And again, affects could be seen here as synonymous to passions, impulses, drives. Emotions are the ways in which we might say a drive manifests itself into our conscious awareness of it, but that a drive, the drive itself is something more basic and fundamental than even the emotions. But to call it an affect, right? A drive affects you. A passion or impulse has an effect on you, on your feelings, on your mental state, your state of mind. And what Nietzsche does in this passage, I think, brilliantly, is to point out he's just giving numerous examples of what a morality could be used for, which, if we revisit the first part of the book, The Prejudices of Philosophers, which is why it's so imperative to understand that first part of the book and the idea of the involuntary unconscious memoir, he's now applying that idea and saying so many moralities take seriously the idea that they're actually being used by their creator. They're functional towards something. What kind of something? Something psychological, right? They're serving a psychological function. But Nietzsche makes it clear that he's not doing this to sort of reduce morality down to a certain type of usefulness or function. He's not being reductive in that way. He's points out in this passage that there are so many different uses or functions that one might find for morality, almost to the point that it would be difficult to come up with some sort of rule for within our new science of morality for saying this is why people come up with these moral codes of valuations and so on and so forth, because really what it is a sign language of the affects, that the morality is something that their drives are pushing into conscious channels in accordance with whatever that drive is driving at, whatever the logic of that drive is. And it might be using morality for any number of things, and we'll just go down the list of things that he says you might use a morality for: to justify, to calm, to make one satisfied, to crucify, to humiliate, to wreak revenge, to conceal, to transfigure, to place oneself at a distance, to forget, to have others forget, to vent power. And then the last example he gives is Kant. What deserves respect in me is that I can obey, and you ought not be different from me. And, it's funny, he uses with Kant like a whole phrase rather than something, but we might just say that his morality, the whole point of it is to obey, to create obedience. This is what the essence of what Kant perceives morality to be, is something to which we must obey regardless of the consequences or personal advantage or disadvantage to us, or however we might feel about it, or whatever we might feel such a morally demanded action or duty might do to our character if we, were to carry it out. No, you simply have the moral duty that you have a responsibility and an obligation to obey. And this is morality to Kant. And so the point of morality is obedience to him. And the simple question is, what does that say about Kant? And most of this is covered again and just back in Prejudices of the Philosophers. But I think it's just very important that Nietzsche is breaking open the question and raising this as, opening up the horizons of possibilities in the study of morality and values creation, or however we want to look at it, a science of how values are weighted and differences between values assessed in the human mind. Because it's not a reductive analysis. It doesn't actually make things simpler. In many ways, it does make things more complicated. 188, quote, "Every morality is, as opposed to letting go, a bit of tyranny against nature, also against reason. But this in itself is no objection, so long as we do not have some other morality which permits us to decree that every kind of tyranny and unreason is impermissible." End quote. So the immoralist standpoint cannot be based on the idea that morality is problematic because morality itself is immoral. That's not actually you inhabiting the immoralist standpoint, making a critique of morality itself on moral grounds. That's just you actually doing what every other moralist does, is asserting a certain moral perspective and then pointing out how every other morality doesn't measure up to yours. But in essence, it's the same mental activity then at that point, which is, a drive universalizing itself and tyrannizing, right? This is why morality is always a tyranny, because every drive that we experience or every affect is itself tyrannical in its disposition, the way it, takes hold of us and directs us and issues orders in some sense, right? And morality is just the same. This is why this is not an objection to it. It's simply a paradox to make an objection on that basis. But it is funny because many people, like I think of groups like, say, the Satanic Temple. There are a lot of people who will make, critiques that they will present as if it is aimed at all of morality itself. But it becomes clear that they actually have a moral agenda of their own, and they just think that all existing moralities, as they're preached, are, oppressive to the human spirit or something, and that they're in favor of freedom. But, there is such a thing as a tyrannical impulse to freedom, right? Hasn't that been the U.S.'s foreign policy to a large extent? You'd better be democratic or we'll shoot you, right? So, we might think of the idea that if somebody is committed to bring anarchism to a state where the people don't want anarchism, is that not itself a form of tyranny, right? And, don't fight me in the comments sections, anarchists. I really Don't want to get into it with y'all in the theory because I just don't know the theory very well. I probably just with that comment invited a bunch of, anarchist theory that's going to be dropped into the comments section now. Okay, we'll get back to the passage. Quote, "What is essential and inestimable in every morality is that it constitutes a long compulsion. To understand Stoicism or Port Royal or Puritanism, one should recall the compulsion under which every language so far has achieved strength and freedom, the metrical compulsion of rhyme and rhythm. How much trouble the poets and orators of all people have taken, not excepting a few prose writers today, in whose ear there dwells an inexorable conscience, for the sake of some foolishness, as utilitarian dolts say, feeling smart, submitting abjectly to capricious laws, as anarchists say, feeling free, even free-spirited. But the curious fact is that all there is or has been on earth of freedom, subtlety, boldness, dance, and masterly sureness, whether in thought itself or in government, or in rhetoric and persuasion, in the arts just as in ethics, has developed only owing to the tyranny of such capricious laws. And in all seriousness, the probability is by no means small that precisely this is nature and natural, and not that letting go." End quote. So Nietzsche, he's using a French term, laisser-aller. I'm sure I'm butchering the French pronunciation, which is why I'm just reading the translation, letting go. But, that has, it's the same word, right, in like laissez-faire, the sense of freedom by just letting everything go, like not taking direct control or charge over anything, and just kind of taking it easy and letting things play out as they may, right? That's what he's talking about when he's talking about letting go. And we might say, Nietzsche might be recognizing this in a sort of like Rousseauian anarchistic notion that, in nature there's a natural freedom. There is a natural liberty that people experience before there was oppression visited upon them by civilization and, the development of technology and the arts and sciences, right? And that therefore letting go and being more in touch with nature and our natural selves is a way of reclaiming our freedom, a natural sense of freedom, right? But we can see that this kind of parallel thought in modern society today. The idea of letting go, became very popular in the 60s and 70s through figures that, I've promoted on the show, like Alan Watts. That's part of his whole philosophy, is taking hold of life by the means of letting go. And Nietzsche has a very striking critique of this insofar as he doesn't actually think that this is possible or can actually be reflected, lived out in our actual lives. Because what we experience is not, this, that we actually have this arbitrarily governing free will that can act as it will in whatever circumstance or, according to our willpower and reason, regardless of our internal drives and impulses and affects and the circumstances around us and the conditions in which we were raised and so on and so forth. And all of these things that sort of are subjective and often arbitrary and irrational, blind processes in many cases that conspire to create you and set you on the course that you are on in life. And yet we still possess this idea, Nietzsche would argue, inherited from the soul idea, that we do have this sort of rationally governing center to ourselves. But the view of life that he has just laid out, calling it sort of back to mind in the previous two sections and throughout the book, throughout Beyond Good and Evil, is one in which this idea of freedom by letting go would mean, in practical terms, just allowing whatever tyrannical drive is strongest in you to run roughshod over your character, right? That the voice in your head, or the whole notion, the whole idea, we'll say, within you of how nice it would be to let go, is a voice in the mouth of a tyrannical drive that would use that whole idea of letting go in order to, we might say, consolidate its power over your psyche. And if this is all, too abstract, we'll just bring it back to what he's sort of saying at the beginning, that every morality is itself a sort of tyranny against nature, this attempt to take something and impose it upon the other drives. It's, a morality being like the conscious expression and elaboration of the world according to a given value, a physiological demand for the preservation of a certain way of life. This is something itself springing from the drives or affects, right? Morality just being a sign language of the affects. Nevertheless, because morality has this dogmatic universalist character, it is a drive trying to tyrannize and universalize over the whole world, or we might say over the entire psyche. But, moralities are mimetic. They move from mind to mind throughout society on these vectors like religion and culture and so on and so forth. And we might say, therefore, that morality is the conscious expression of a drive attempting to universalize itself and play master over everything. And that so morality never represents this idea of letting go, quote unquote, not in and of itself, right? Because Stoicism is a great example. Nietzsche says Stoicism is self-tyranny earlier in this text, but it's something that you have to work on and engage in active combat with the drives that do not fit within that particular creative pattern, right, of the Stoics' life. They have this drive to discipline, or I don't know what we'll say the drive behind Stoicism might be, but we might just use that as, that self-discipline is their ultimate goal, and all of the drives or impulses they have that don't fit under that plan are going to be rooted out, in this sort of display of endurance of the willpower set against the passions, right? This is what always happens within any moral system. Okay, we'll continue with the text now. Quote, "Every artist knows how far from any feeling of letting himself go his most natural state is. The free ordering, placing, disposing, giving form in the moment of inspiration, and how strictly and subtly he obeys thousandfold laws precisely then, laws that precisely on account of their hardness and determination defy all formulation through concepts. Even the firmest concept is, compared with them, not free of fluctuation, multiplicity, and ambiguity." End quote. And so I'm glad Nietzsche returned to that, because it's an element I didn't elaborate much on that he was talking about earlier in the sections I read before, of the true freedom, Nietzsche's saying, being found within that tyranny or within that constraint, and that every artist knows this insofar as these laws of, we might say, creativity are themselves so ironclad that they're more ironclad than any concept, that every concept is almost too flighty and vague to really encapsulate what, say, a law of good taste might be in art, right? That we might just make this as simple as, when you hear a good song or a good singer, right? And I don't just mean somebody who's technically good, but you hear a singer that just, what people tend to focus on in creativity would be all the aspects of a great vocal performance that transcend the technical in some sense, right? The elements of grit or soul, or all of these words that sort of mean everything and nothing, right? And it's so hard to define. But the fact is that, Nietzsche's pointing to here, that law of creativity, it's so ironclad that when you hear a great singer, even if you can't describe why, right? In technical language, why that was a good performance, or that was just simply a transcendent performance, whereas what that singer did was technically good, but, nothing brilliant, right? You may not be able to find the words or any sort of logical principle to explain this, but that doesn't change the reality that the emotional resonance, the blunt force of a powerful performance will always be that. And the artist knows this, and this is why he says, at the moment of their, quote, inspiration, he puts it in scare quotes, because, of course, it's not something coming from above, from a god or a muse. It's coming from within them. But how strictly and subtly, at precisely this moment, that's where the artist obeys 1,000 laws. And those, I believe, are the types of laws that Nietzsche is talking about, right? If we were to put them into words, it would be to butcher them or to mangle them. It wouldn't really get it across. But when you see like Prince play a guitar solo, where you're just like, God damn, he's one of the greatest of all time. And if I were to break down and explain to you technically all the ways, I would have to justify that statement, it wouldn't do it justice, right? And it never could. Okay. Next section, quote, "What is essential in heaven and on earth seems to be, to say it once more, that there should be obedience over a long period of time and in a single direction, given that something always develops and has developed for whose sake it is worthwhile to live on earth. For example, virtue, art, music, dance, reason, spirituality, something transfiguring, subtle, mad, and divine. The long unfreedom of the spirit, the mistrustful constraint in the communicability of thoughts, the disciplined thinkers imposed on themselves to think within the directions laid down by a church or court, or under Aristotelian presuppositions, the long spiritual will to interpret all events under a Christian schema, and to rediscover and justify the Christian God in every accident. All this, however forced, capricious, hard, gruesome, and anti-rational, has shown itself to be the means through which the European spirit has been trained to strength, ruthless curiosity, and subtle mobility, though admittedly in the process an irreplaceable amount of strength and spirit had to be crushed, stifled, and ruined. For here as everywhere, nature manifests herself as she is, in all her prodigal and indifferent magnificence, which is outrageous but noble." End quote. So we might call to mind what Nietzsche said about nature in the passage on the Stoics way back in the first book, right? Nature is indifference itself as power. And here he says nature displays an indifference that is outrageous but noble, right? There's something about the nobility that they are willing to spend lavishly, expend great strength to gain their purpose, because they have their sights set on a higher task beyond anything like material advancement or self-preservation, and sometimes therefore are willing to sacrifice crazy things, right? Crazy amounts of wealth in pursuit of their goal. Or it may look crazy to us, right? But because of the tyranny of the moral aim that they are proceeding towards, right? To give one example, they're willing to crush out. It's almost inconceivable, right? Nietzsche says the amount of strength or the amount of things out of the European spirit, the amount of drives or impulses or creative expressions of a drive that could have potentially sprouted during the entire period of medieval Christendom, that was destroyed, plucked out, excised of the European mind. Nietzsche says we did gain something from that. This focus, this subtle, ruthless curiosity and strength towards the will to truth, the very faculty that Nietzsche is now using to turn the eye of investigation against Christianity itself and indeed even morality itself. And so he's not squandering it, right? He's using it for his purposes. But in order to gain this one like little gem, it's paid for in so much blood. And that is the disturbing truth at the heart of so many of Nietzsche's insights, and especially the ones that people really don't want to look at, that he's constantly reminding us of the ways in which suffering and death and exploitation all were necessary in order for you to live and have the pleasures and comforts and opportunities that you have today. And so, all of these things, virtue, art, music, dance, reason, spirituality, these treasures of the human experience were paid for in blood, right? They were paid for in the course of this project of civilization that is inherently brutal because it's something of nature, right? Again, it's fundamentally opposed to Rousseau's conception of what nature is. And once again, we have this idea of, by being constrained in a single direction, the strengthening of the creative power, right? Freedom found in limitation. That's the freedom that Nietzsche's found. That only in post-Enlightenment Europe could you have a figure like Nietzsche who would have such a strongly developed will to truth, and this will to find a dispassionate, detached logic, that he would actually gain the insights that he has into the farce behind all of our attempts at becoming dispassionate, detached logic seekers, right? To turn the will to truth against itself. Where else could you find that? Well, in a civilization that's been so thoroughly directed towards that ends. That's how Nietzsche's found the freedom that he has. So we'll finish the passage here. Quote, that for thousands of years European thinkers thought merely in order to prove something. Today, conversely, we suspect every thinker who wants to prove something that the conclusions that ought to be the result of their most rigorous reflection were always settled from the start, just as it used to be with Asiatic astrology, and still is today with the innocuous Christian moral interpretation of our most intimate personal experiences. For the glory of God and for the salvation of the soul, this tyranny, this caprice, this rigorous and grandiose stupidity has educated the spirit. Slavery is, as it seems, both in the cruder and in the more subtle sense, the indispensable means of spiritual discipline and cultivation too. Consider any morality with this in mind. What there is in it of nature teaches hatred of the laisser-aller, letting go, of any all too great freedom, and implants the need for limited horizons and nearest tasks, teaching the narrowing of our perspective, and thus, in a certain sense, stupidity as a condition of life and growth. You shall obey someone and for a long time, else you will perish and lose the last respect for yourself. This appears to me to be the moral imperative of nature, which, to be sure, is neither categorical as the old Kant would have it, hence the else, nor addressed to the individual. What do individuals matter to her? But to peoples, races, ages, classes, but above all to the whole human animal, to man. End quote. And so, morality, the narrowing of perspective, and in a certain sense, therefore, stupidity. So, complete, total narrowing into the singular goal to the point of irrationality, right? But that's a condition of life and growth. That untruth, once again, might be a condition to life. That this, what might we say, the anti-nature and tyrannical aspects of morality are themselves natural, because that morality is an expression of a natural drive which naturally attempts to tyrannize over the world. And the mistake is that this is not categorical, right? This isn't something, as Kant would have it, that is ascertained through cold logical research. In some sense, we're always doing it in whatever, form that it may take. We can't avoid moralizing in this way. But we might say, again, it is important, that last line, because, what does he say? What do individuals matter to her, to nature? The individual of the species doesn't matter, right? We are transitory things. We spawn and then we die. Human beings just have the benefit of, having a conscious existence that goes beyond spawning and dying, unlike, the salmon or whatever the case may be with a lot of other animals, that we, raise our children and are around for a large portion of their lives, and even well past when we, can reproduce and have offspring. But that this is the only thing that's really, if we want to personify nature, as Nietzsche's been doing, really quote unquote matters to Mother Nature, right? It's not there's no intrinsic inherent value in the individual within the natural world. That is such a strange concept. And so, in a sense, by departing from moral idealism and returning us to a natural approach to life, what that really means, right? When Nietzsche says a natural history of morals, that is a brutal phrase. It's a terrifying phrase. And a lot of people, when we think of natural history, we think of a museum, right? We think of something that's incredibly sedate and boring, so we don't think of it as something dangerous. But Nietzsche doing a natural history of morals, an immoral, anti-idealistic understanding of morals, one in which morals can't be encompassed in categorical duties, obtained by reason, but which are in some sense more tyrannical even than that. Remember, there's other passages where Nietzsche says that to call what nature does exploitation almost doesn't justify. It's not a strong enough word. And what this truly means is that we're looking into a world where there is no value in the individual life at all. There is a sort of almost unbelievable insignificance to the individual life, considered from the perspective of nature, the indifference as power of nature, which should tell us something. It's not that Nietzsche's philosophy then is necessarily anti-individualistic. There is something about solitude, once again, about becoming a true individual by separating yourself from all of these things, these concentric circles that he mentions, peoples, races, ages, and classes, because these are all moral supra-identifications that people make in order to, attach themselves and their identity to some sort of superstructure of a collective beyond themselves. But that by withdrawing totally into your own individuality, that's how one gains the sort of perspective on morality that might be necessary to raise this sort of inquiry, because otherwise you'll continue super-identifying with that greater collective than yourself, and that won't represent like any opportunity to use your individual reason. That will just overwhelm your individual reason. All right, so let's move on. So 189, quote, "Industrious races find it very troublesome to endure leisure. It was a masterpiece of English instinct to make the Sabbath so holy and so boring that the English begin unconsciously to lust again for their work in weekday. It is a kind of cleverly invented, cleverly inserted fast, the like of which is also encountered frequently in the ancient world, although in fairness to southern peoples, not exactly in regard to work. There have to be fasts of many kinds, and wherever powerful drives and habits prevail, legislators have to see to it that intercalary days are inserted on which such a drive is chained and learns again to hunger. Viewed from a higher vantage point, whole generations and ages that make their appearance infected with some moral fanaticism seem to be such times of constraint and fasting, during which a drive learns to stoop and submit, but also to purify and sharpen itself. A few philosophical sects, too, permit such an interpretation, for example, the Stoa in the midst of Hellenistic culture with its lascivious atmosphere, overcharged with aphrodisiac odors. This is also a hint for an explanation of the paradox, why it was precisely during the most Christian period of Europe, and altogether only under the pressure of Christian value judgments, that the sex drive sublimated itself into love." End quote. And Walter Kaufmann notes here, Nietzsche is the first one to use Sublimation in its specifically modern sense. And he notes that this is widely associated with Sigmund Freud. But we get this idea first in Nietzsche, that in many ways the entire moral activity of human beings can be seen as the sublimation of what we might say is like sort of like the vulgar or most base expression of a drive or an affect into something like love, which can become a virtue, right? And he points out through the examples that he gives earlier in this passage how this sort of rhythm, and this was something I meant to bring up with the last section, but it's illustrated here very well. The entire idea of fasting during certain periods as sort of a regular, reoccurring thing where the drive is chained and then learns to hunger again, and then therefore has to purify and sharpen itself. That it introduces some sort of, again, rhythm and regularity to the way that the drives ebb and flow and are satisfied or are like restrained within the given society. And so he brings that up earlier as like that every morality is sort of like setting this regularity and a rhythm over our lives, and that all more successful moralities, including Stoicism, the other examples he gives, have that aspect to them. But we can see this in the religious calendars and the way that religious holidays sort of signify different periods of life throughout the year, in which, Christians have this with Lent as the most obvious example, Muslims during Ramadan, Buddhists during Uposatha, and so on and so forth. And, an important aspect of what he's saying here, love. Think of the spiritual significance of love, and he designates, specifically amor, passion, right? Passionate sort of romantic love, but all of the spiritual and virtuous elaborations upon this theme with the medieval idea of chastity and sort of higher love, right? The heights that love reached in the psyche, in the European psyche, under Christendom, outrival even the Greeks in their higher eros, right? And that this was during a time of the complete suppression and sort of shaming of the sexual impulse, such that it was forced to sublimate itself so beautifully, to sharpen itself and purify itself in order to survive and propagate within this harsh environment. Aphorism 190, quote, "There is something in the morality of Plato that does not really belong to Plato, but is merely encountered in his philosophy. One might say in spite of Plato, namely the Socratism for which he was really too noble." And then Nietzsche is presumably quoting from the voice of the Platonist or Socratist here. He says, quote, "Nobody wants to do harm to himself, therefore all that is bad is done involuntarily. For the bad do harm to themselves. This they would not do if they knew that bad is bad. Hence the bad are bad only because of an error. If one removes the error, one necessarily makes them good." And end quote. Nietzsche continues in this passage, "This type of inference smells of the rabble that sees nothing in bad actions but the unpleasant consequences, and really judges it is stupid to do what is bad, while good is taken without further ado to be identical with useful and agreeable. In the case of every moral utilitarianism, one may immediately infer the same origin and follow one's nose. One will rarely go astray. Plato did everything he could in order to read something refined and noble into the proposition of his teacher, above all himself. He was the most audacious of all interpreters and took the whole Socrates only the way one picks a popular tune in folk song from the streets in order to vary it into the infinite and impossible, namely into all his own masks and multiplicities. In a jest, Homeric at that. What is the Platonic Socrates after all, if not the prosthe Platon, opeten te Platon messe te chimera? And if you will forgive my ancient Greek there, Plato in front and Plato behind, and in the middle, chimera. So in one sense, Nietzsche is returning to the theme he brought forward in the preface, that the Socratism that is encountered within Plato, almost in spite of Plato. So there's this respect for Plato as this noble soul, in some sense, and yet Socrates, this pleb, this man of the rabble, who sees nothing but the bad consequences in bad actions, unpleasant consequences, right? And the useful and agreeable things to be good. So this is the kind of morality that would come out of the lower class position in society. And this is what Nietzsche later elaborates on in the Genealogy of Morals as the slave morality. Socrates, gives the slave moralistic perspective, and it's on the basis of that he then construes, what might we say, badness into ignorance, fundamentally, and reason as the source of virtue. Because if one could only figure out how to do less harm and do more good for the most people, right, of course one would take that path. It's only their ignorance in thinking that, I can just steal this in order to get by in the short term, not realizing, the damage that they're doing to their soul or their moral character, right? Or the ways in which, if we take a Kantian bent, not universalizing their actions before choosing how to act, they don't understand that they're undermining the very institution of private property by dating to steal, right? If only they could see the ways in which their actions are ultimately harmful to themselves and to their own freedom, autonomy, virtue, or whatever it is. If they could see that, the bad person would not be bad. And Nietzsche rejects this as, for one, he sort of points to it as like, what a strange, almost alien idea to Plato that one encounters with him almost in spite of him. In spite of the noble, grand vision of, creating this idealized society, or the, all these things we might find in Plato, we have this conflation of reason with goodness out of a slave moralistic perspective. That is what? It's basically the same underlying principle that Schopenhauer points to as the basis of all morality, Nietzsche's making fun of Schopenhauer for saying this because Schopenhauer is sort of pointing to that moral intuition as this, therefore, if not objective truth, irrefutable truth or inarguable truth. And Nietzsche just sees that as Schopenhauer getting caught in the snare of morality again. But what Schopenhauer identifies is this common moralistic perspective, this common moralistic sort of orientation or approach to life that, Nietzsche brings up utilitarianism here. I've just mentioned Kant, and of course we're talking about Socrates and Plato. So that includes virtue ethics, deontology, utilitarianism. These distinctions, in some sense, I think Nietzsche might argue are false, because ultimately it all comes from that same origin of how do we prevent the most harm and do the greatest good to all that we possibly can, right? Provide the greatest comfort, or, reduce the most harm to the most that we can. And that regardless of their theoretical differences, that we might say there is a logic in utilitarianism arriving onto the scene in the way that it does, and that it's sort of almost the distillation of this full expression of what morality really is, put into an abstract, decontextualized terms, right? Decontextualized from one's character or circumstances, or from even the concept of moral duties or anything of that nature. To return basically to this fundamentally Socratic perspective of that it is stupid to do harm, and that goodness is to do what is useful and agreeable to the most people. And then, of course, he has the interesting reversal at the end, is that Nietzsche is then raising the question that, well, ultimately all that Plato could do, because he's still his own individual, simply reflecting and representing Socrates. Socrates becomes a character within Plato's works, and then in a way is Socrates as interpreted by Plato, which means, in simpler terms, just Plato. Plato in front, Plato behind, and in the middle, chimera, right? Which, of course, takes us back to this theory of the multiplicity of drives, which is the real nature of the individual. But that Plato only took elements in Socrates and exaggerated them according to his own fashion and according to his own drives and his own moral aims, which means that, in effect, this passage, 190, is Nietzsche taking the opposite stance, or refuting, going against the accusation that Socrates corrupted the youth, that he corrupted Plato, or that Plato's evidence of Socrates corrupting the youth, because Socrates can't corrupt Plato, right? Only Plato can be ultimately responsible for Plato, and how he incorporates Socrates is just as much a reflection of Plato, right? You can't ever, it's something I often, a lesson I would say I learned from the late great Alan Watson that I never tire of repeating. You can't abdicate your own authority. It's simply not possible, because even if you select an authority figure, you selected it, which means you are an authority to select authority figures. So can't get away from that. Plato can't get away from that. So, perhaps this is Nietzsche speaking more seriously about that initial question in the preface, that Plato cannot be corrupted by Socrates, that it is ultimately Plato we do have to blame, because that was within him, this Socratism of morality. All right, so we'll go to 191. Quote, "The ancient theological problem of faith and knowledge, or more clearly of instinct and reason, in other words, the question whether regarding the valuation of things, instinct deserves more authority than rationality, which wants us to evaluate and act in accordance with reasons, with a why, in other words, in accordance with expedience and utility, this is still the ancient moral problem that first emerged in the person of Socrates and divided thinking people long before Christianity." End quote. And so I just want to point out here how there is this relationship in Nietzsche between consciousness and the collective moral valuations. And in a sense, it almost transcends or goes beyond what Nietzsche might call the slave morality, because it suggests that, it's what you might call in more broad terms the herd morality, right? Maybe we can conceive of that as a broader concentric circle, with like slave morality as a specific type of it, because the very fact of living within a world, a rational world, a world of reasons, where everything must be justified by a why, necessarily tilts toward a world of expedience and utility. That the pursuit of utility as the very definition and essence of morality. Nietzsche's invoking Socrates here again, which certainly goes back to the person of Socrates. But this occurs cross-culturally. We can find this bent in Confucianism, which has nothing to do with the entire Western canon, right? So the world which we represent to ourselves in terms of concepts, the only world of which we can really communicate, because the very act of communication always takes place within this world, we might say, and thus it is like sort of the linguistic conceptual world that you and I are inhabiting and communicating in right now, just in the act of you listening to this podcast, that this world is inherently tilted against the natural reality of instinct, so to speak, for all the reasons that we've discussed, owing to our grammar and to our, the rules that we impose upon concepts which make them unitary, enduring, persistence of being that seems to occur in the conceptual world. For all of these reasons, the state of merely being conscious, of remembering, of being a remembering being, is going to incline us towards seeking after things like expedience and utility. You almost couldn't have the concept of such things. Like moralism is indelibly linked with the intellect in some respect. And that there is the possibility, for Nietzsche at least, of he's constantly reminding us of a way of life prior to self-recognition or self-remembering, or having to give reasons. That in some sense, the noble stupidity, right, of being completely self-assured in one's instincts and unself-reflective in many ways, that this represents what you might call a natural freedom, though not in the Rousseauian sense, right? Because it's a reality one lives in, which is governed by these tyrannical drives or affects. But what follows in this passage is Nietzsche, therefore, outlining his critique of Socrates, I would say in the most explicit terms, since the beginning of the text. And so he writes, quote, Socrates himself, to be sure, with the taste of his talent, that of a superior dialectician, had initially sided with reason. And in fact, what did he do his life long but laugh at the awkward incapacity of noble Athenians who, like all noble men, were men of instinct and never could give sufficient information about the reasons for their actions? In the end, however, privately and secretly, he laughed at himself too. In himself he found, before his subtle conscience and self-examination, the same difficulty and incapacity. But is that any reason he encouraged himself for giving up the instincts? One has to see to it that they, as well as reason, receive their due. One must follow the instincts, but persuade reason to assist them with good reasons. This was the real falseness of that great ironic, so rich in secrets. He got his conscience to be satisfied with a kind of self-trickery. At bottom, he had seen through the irrational element in moral judgments, end quote. So a couple interesting things there. For one, he's criticizing Socrates along the lines that we laid out, that by bringing reason and this questioning will to truth before the unself-reflective instincts of the Athenian nobility, was he actually doing them a favor? Well, he'll suggest elsewhere in his work that he was not, that this was a symptom of the decline of Athenian society, that the failing certainty in their way of life and their morality was a sign of their impending downfall. But perhaps more to the point, Nietzsche, if we notice how he describes Socrates there, he describes Socrates as very much one like himself, as coming to the same conclusions that Nietzsche did, that what lies at the basis of all moral judgments is an irrational element. And this sheds light on Nietzsche's comments in the Birth of Tragedy preface that he added in 1886, where he says, "O Socrates, you great ironist, was this perhaps your irony?" And what he's talking about in that passage is, of course, the problem of science, of this will to truth turned upon itself, right? The pursuit of science, of knowledge of the world turned against our own drive for knowledge, right? If we discover that the world is a natural world where everything within it came out of these natural dynamic evolutionary processes, then so too did our drive for knowledge and the danger of asking this question. And, he speaks of sort of Socrates' relationship with art and his anti-artistic attitude, his attitude of, holding reason and philosophy as above all of the arts and as the necessary governing force, and art as a thing to be distrusted and at times censored. And yet, what is it at the base of Socrates' character? Well, Nietzsche in The Birth of Tragedy preface in 1886 believes that it was an artistic impulse. And another way of saying that is this same thing here, that privately and secretly, Socrates laughs at himself too, because he also doesn't have an explanation for himself for why he behaves the way he does. So in the same way he ridicules and questions and brings this vivisecting knife to the lives of the Athenian nobles, and they can't answer, why it is that they obey the gods, or why it is that a good statesman must have virtue X, Y, and Z because some ancient writer said so, or whatever silly justification they give for themselves and their actions, that in the end, Socrates brings them to a place where they have to admit their own ignorance. They only know that they know nothing. And Socrates is the kind of man who actually knows that about himself. So he can laugh at himself too. I don't know why I'm the kind of man who does what he does. And the best example of this is the fact that Socrates has his daemon, his demon, right? Which is a divine spirit, a good spirit that acts as Socrates' moral conscience throughout his life, right? And so he has his recourse to these irrational explanations that ultimately in modern terms would just boil down to, that's just his conviction. He just is the way he is. He has his irrational impulse that makes him this monstrous, overgrown intellect applying the dialectical knife to everything around him, right? And that's sort of how Nietzsche will describe Socrates in Twilight of the Idols. He's sort of like a monstrous intellect. And so we'll finish out this passage here. Quote, "Plato, more innocent in such matters and lacking the craftiness of the plebeian, wanted to employ all his strength, the greatest strength any philosopher so far has had at his disposal, to prove to himself that reason and instinct of themselves tend toward the one goal, the good, God. And since Plato, all theologians and philosophers are on the same track. That is, in moral matters it has so far been instinct, or what the Christians call faith, or the herd, as I put it, that has triumphed. Perhaps Descartes should be expected as the father of rationalism, and hence the grandfather of the Revolution, who conceded authority to reason alone. But reason is merely an instrument, and Descartes was superficial." End quote. And that is, I think, one of the sickest burns in philosophy and in all of Nietzsche, and you rarely hear that one quoted out of Nietzsche's many burns to various philosophers and philosophical schools. Descartes was superficial because it's true. It hurts because it's true. That ultimately Descartes is simply this laundering of Enlightenment ideals this laundering of religious idols into Enlightenment ideals, putting the religious superstitions of the soul and of mainly the soul, but the epistemological belief, the metaphysics and the moral superstructure of Christianity, taking the first steps toward translating it into a strictly rational language. And that is a rather superficial task. It is surface level, right? It's simply a matter of translation. But of course, the other aspects of that passage, Nietzsche, again, invokes this idea, all theologians and philosophers are on the same track. There's that sort of vague and yet all-encompassing and really sort of like absolutist moral ideal that Schopenhauer articulated for us that appears here in the work of Plato. And again, as Nietzsche says, what the Christians call faith, or the herd, as I have put it, has always triumphed. And so, it's because in this collective world of consciousness, that is what our thinking will incline to, is to applying our reason to solve the problem of how do we create the circumstances that are most useful, expedient, have the most utility for the many, because that is what reason is designed to do. And I don't know if I feel like I kind of stumbled through that earlier trying to give that explanation, but that's probably the best, most succinct way to put it, that if consciousness exists as this net of communication between individuals, it is an instrument of the herd, and therefore the logic of our thinking and the logic of our language is also an instrument of the herd, right? We reason towards these moral ends that we always do because in some sense, there is a moral aim for thinking itself, right? It's not just like it has metaphysical presuppositions. I sort of brought those up before, which are important to think about, mostly regarding being and how language inclines towards substance and being, thinking of being in terms of essence or substance, but that there is a moral aim in our language, right? The herd always wins out, or beyond language, in our very thinking and the very structure of conscious thought, that against setting reason against the instincts, reason always inclines towards it always sets out down that road that ends at utilitarianism, right? That Descartes begins walking down, making everything pure reason, so to speak. But it's reason because there is never any dispassionate, detached reason, right? When you philosophize towards just reifying the conventional moral sentiments, it's always towards, reason to solve the problem of the greatest good for the greatest many. Okay, I think I've gotten that relatively clearly. Let me know in the comments section if I rambled on and made absolutely no sense. Although I think most of the trolls have probably stopped listening by now. So, all right, we'll go on to 192. Quote, "Whoever has traced the history of an individual science finds a clue in its development for understanding the most ancient and common processes of all knowledge and cognition. There, as here, it is the rash hypotheses, the fictions, the good dumb will to believe, the lack of mistrust and patience that are developed first, Our senses learn only late and never learn entirely to be subtle, faithful, and cautious organs of cognition. Our eye finds it more comfortable to respond to a given stimulus by reproducing once more an image that it has produced many times before, instead of registering what is different and new in an impression. The latter would require more strength, more morality. And brief aside, end quote, brief aside, Nietzsche has morality there in scare quotes. And I don't always take the time to say when Nietzsche puts something in quotes, but I thought it was important to do so here. Back to the text. Quote, hearing something new is embarrassing and difficult for the ear. Foreign music we do not hear well. When we hear another language, we try involuntarily to form the sounds we hear into words that sound more familiar and more like home to us. Thus, the German, for example, transformed Arquebalista, when he heard that, into Armbrust. What is new finds our senses too hostile and reluctant, and even in the simplest processes of sensation, the effects dominate, such as fear, love, hatred, including the passive affects of laziness. End quote. So, in large part, what Nietzsche starts out doing here is simply to remind us as to why the science of morality, or any attempt at understanding morality objectively or scientifically thus far, has failed. And that's insofar as psychology is simply a new science. And in the history of, the sciences striking out on this path of knowledge, we follow those instincts which have been best developed first, which are the herd instincts. Again, this is just another way in which the thought is almost always herd thought. And this is a really serious problem that we have to confront if we take Nietzsche seriously in his whole theory of cognition, and insofar as one actually has the values of wanting to be an individual or have some solitude, mental or psychological solitude, and be separate from the crowd, right? Because in some sense, you're always swimming upstream in that regard. But Nietzsche's already kind of outlined that case. The most interesting aspects of this is that really what he's saying about sensation and sense impressions. That is true, by the way, in terms of modern neuroscience, that, our eyes, like our field of vision, especially when we're taking in something that we've seen many times before, our eyes are not actually necessarily taking in the entire scene. What's happening is our brain is filling in a lot of the gaps. I mean, one of the most basic things is that actually the way that the light enters your retinas, the image you're getting is upside down, and then your brain turns it right side up. Also, your retinas, after, just being alive for a long enough period of time, your eyes, your visual sensations technically should be like full of holes, and, it's passing through, veins and all sorts of things that should actually be in your field of vision that your brain just edits out. And you're never even aware of the fact that your mind is doing half of the seeing for you. It's filling in the gaps for you. And that to truly perceive something that has not yet been perceived before is also, I'll use the same metaphor, sort of swimming against the current. Because so much of how we perceive is filled in by the brain. That so much of what we would think of as being pure sensation is already being tampered with by cognition. And the most interesting aspect, I think, for Nietzsche's continued purposes here are that the simplest, and he has simplest in scare quotes as well, the quote, simplest processes of sensation, the affects, those passions, drives, impulses, etc., the things that make you up as a living being, these dominate, as they do elsewhere, fear, love, and hatred, and even including passive affects such as laziness, which sort of ties into the whole thing, right? That the easiest thing for you to do is to reproduce, for your mind to reproduce to itself the perceptions which fit within the familiar, which you already sort of understand and makes sense within the broader picture that your brain has learned to take in ever since you were a child, according to all of these things that we've discussed, the way you've been raised to perceive the world, and the language that does a lot of our thinking for us in understanding the world, and so on and so forth. And that remark about the Armbrust, the Germans transformed Arqubalista into Armbrust. The word literally means arm breast. Arqubalista, I believe that's comes from arquebus, or that's the same term, but it basically means a crossbow. But the Germans, hearing this word, Nietzsche's pointing out how they just shaped it into some familiar syllables. So in this attempt at translation, this happens all the time in translation, by the way, where we take words that sort of sound similar in our language and either portmanteau them or alter them slightly to resemble the foreign word that we're trying to abduct and put into our language, which then gives it a whole new etymological meaning. And it's an example of using the familiar to explain or fit in that which is novel into our thinking. So we'll continue with the passage quote. Just as little as a reader today reads all of the individual words, let alone syllables on a page, rather he picks about 5 words at random out of 20 and guesses at the meaning that probably belongs to these 5 words. Just as little do we see a tree exactly and completely with reference to leaves, twigs, color, and form. It is so very much easier for us simply to improvise some approximation of a tree. Even in the midst of the strangest experiences, we still do the same. We make up the major part of the experience and can scarcely be forced not to contemplate some event as its inventors. All this means, basically, and from time immemorial, we are accustomed to lying. Or to put it more virtuously and hypocritically, in short, more pleasantly, one is much more of an artist than one knows. In an animated conversation, I often see the face of the person with whom I am talking so clearly and so subtly determined in accordance with the thought he expresses, or that I believe has been produced in him, that this degree of clarity far surpasses my powers of vision. So the subtle shades of the play of the muscles and the expression of the eyes must have been made up by me. Probably the person made an altogether different face, or none at all." End quote. And so, once again, the remarkable thing about this book and the entire project of Beyond Good and Evil is that Nietzsche is always willing to apply his rules to himself. Even if we might think that he does so inconsistently, or maybe not as completely as he applies, or maybe not as savagely as he's willing to apply his method to his other philosophical interlocutors, but that Nietzsche is more than willing to see the ways in which he's basically pointing out how our thought, again, deceives us and deceives even our sensations of the world, or constructs and authors this whole story, right? That's to a large part what the consciousness does, as a narrative function, putting things into a comprehensible narrative, and how we're always doing this, and that there is an inventive element of this, which we could call a fabrication or a falsification of the world. And Nietzsche says the nice way to put it is that one's more of an artist than one knows. There is a link between art and deception. And we've talked about this before. You can go listen to the episode on the artist, which I think will be very useful for understanding Beyond Good and Evil, even though a lot of the material I cover in that section is from Human All Too Human. Human All Too Human is a great preparatory work for Beyond Good and Evil, and he has a long extended discussion of the deceptive nature of artistry and how art is an act of falsifying the world to a large degree. And so this, again, relates to how one way to phrase what Nietzsche's philosophical approach is in this work is seeing the ways in which our philosophy and our science is premised on art, premised on those initial falsifications, those initial irrational axioms, the germ out of which the entire tree then grows, right? And what Nietzsche says here, it goes beyond, the example I gave earlier with the retinas. That's certainly the most fundamental way in which our mind deceives us as to even what the nature of our perception of reality is. But Nietzsche's pointing out the way that we fill in familiar details. Like when you see a tree, if you're just, driving by and there's a little copse of trees or something, right? And let's say they're all pine trees, and you've seen plenty of pine trees in your life, your brain is just, you're not really seeing the trees in all of their detail. You're not seeing each individual pixel of reality, or however we want to put it. Your brain is sort of copy and pasting is the argument Nietzsche's making. And again, this passage is somewhat remarkable insofar as Nietzsche is mostly been borne out by modern cognitive neuroscience, and he's mostly gets there through philosophical speculation, right? Nietzsche, I mean, he certainly was familiar with a lot of scientific literature, and especially by the Neo-Kantians who were very interested in this issue, but it's interesting that Nietzsche doesn't, he's not an experimental scientist, and he doesn't get there through that means. He gets there through insight alone, philosophical thought alone. So with that being said, we can move on. This passage 192, I think, is fascinating because, again, in terms of a chapter on morality, Nietzsche doesn't mention morality too much in this passage, except insofar as this entire passage is a challenge to our basic presuppositions as regards what the truth is. Because again, Nietzsche is not attempting to call into question the veracity of our senses in order to suggest that there's a real world behind those senses. What would the world be if those senses weren't there, right? You could make an argument that it's sort of an incomprehensible or necessarily absurd statement to talk about the world independently of all of our senses, because for all intents and purposes, the world is within our senses, right? That's the only way the only reference we have for interacting with the world, so to speak. That's our interface with it, right? That's where we collide with the world, is in the form of sensation. But even this is not, it's not an objective, honest, what would we say, detached perception of the world, even the immediate sense information. This still is your world, or on the broader scale, a human world, but it's not an objective world. And that right there calls into question the relationship between truth and falsehood. Again, truth built on a foundation of falsehood, and even our direct sensory perceptions as built upon the foundations of our mind's, what would we say, unconscious editing of our perception, right? The ways in which the world is indelibly a world for us, and this has profound effects on what a science of morals might look like. Okay, let's move on to 193. It starts out with some Latin, and I'm just going to read, when I begin quoting, not the Latin phrase, but the translation. Quote, "What occurred in the light goes on in the dark, but the other way around, too. What we experience in dreams, assuming that we experience it often, belongs in the end just as much to the overall economy of our soul as anything experienced, quote-unquote, actually. We are richer or poorer on account of it, have one need more or less, and finally are led a little by the habits of our dreams, even in broad daylight, and in the most cheerful moments of our wide-awake spirit. Suppose someone has flown often in his dreams, and finally, as soon as he dreams, he is conscious of his power and art of flight as if it were his privilege, also his characteristic and enviable happiness. He believes himself capable of realizing every kind of arc and angle simply by the lightest impulse. He knows the feeling of a certain divine frivolity, an upward without tension and constraint, a downward without condescension and humiliation, without gravity. How could a human being who had such dream experiences and dream habits fail to find that the word happiness had a different color and definition in his waking life, too? How could he fail to desire happiness differently? Rising, as described by poets, must seem to him, compared with this flying, too earthbound, muscle-bound, forced, too grave." End quote. And there's a very obvious, he has grave and scare quotes, and the implication there is in English, what Kaufman is trying to capture is the relationship between grave, as in serious. We might think of, in musical notation, one of the slowest, I think perhaps the slowest tempos is grave, right? So, a grave, solemn, slow, this is the pace of a funeral doom song. If you'll pardon my doom metal analogies here. It's like a funeral procession. It's a dirge, a funeral dirge, right? So grave and gravity. the heaviness, the weight, right? And remember how in Zarathustra's enemy is the spirit of gravity. That's the devil of Nietzsche's Bible, is the spirit of gravity. And he describes this character in this passage who was able to move upward without straining, right? With just the lightest impulse, and to move downward without condescension and humiliation. And what he's describing here then is free-spiritedness, right? To be untethered in terms of, so the weight that, let's apply this to the broader context of the natural history of morals in light of everything that he has been saying up to this point in this passage. To be able to go to the heights of, we might say, nobility and virtue and so on and so forth, or to the lows of sadism and cruelty and vice without feeling that moral stain, right? To go to the heights without feeling something of constraint and limitation and having to strive to get there, which is part and parcel with, we might say, the moralistic interpretations of what virtue is, not understanding that it is something relative and springing from that which is base or unvirtuous, as Nietzsche has argued throughout this text, but to also go down to the low, the abhorrent aspects of human life and the human experience without humiliation or shame or all those other moral judgments upon ourselves for stooping to that level, or upon the world. And that the weight of morality is what the free spirit is ultimately liberated from. That through this process of stepping outside morality by comparing and vivisecting multiples, you are then freed from the weight of your particular moral outlook on life, and then able to, notice what would the practical consequences, right, of embodying multiple perspectives and viewing the issue of morality, the problem or the challenge of morality, the question of morality from multiple perspectives. But again, to contextualize this, just within the logic of this passage, Nietzsche doesn't say all of this. It is brought forward as something, a supposition of what could potentially happen to an unnamed person in a dream. And this is premised by the argument that the things that occur, the experiences and feelings and sensations that we take in dreams are just as important to shaping our overall experience of life, and therefore who we are, what the story of our lives are, as our waking experiences. And understanding this as to why this is, why Nietzsche would make this claim, it could really be as simple as imagining someone who, let's say somebody who lives in a mansion and is rich and has every comfort and luxury provided for him, but he's tormented every night with terrifying nightmares, springing from perhaps his own shame, or maybe because his mother didn't hug him enough, or whoever, this hypothetical character that we're, considering. And that if you spent every night, in just abject terror, even if your waking life were, cush and luxurious, it would be difficult to say that such a person actually lived a good life. That if half their time, if the unconscious, the nighttime half of their life was dominated by terrible experiences, it calls into question, the entire, whether that person could love their fate, for example. And Nietzsche's reason for bringing this up, I think, is not just in order to give this metaphor of free-spiritedness as illustrated by this hypothetical dream. Although we might wonder if Nietzsche himself had this experience, given how he describes it, or had this type of dream. Many people have had flying dreams, right? But I think he is raising something. He's leaning into the objection that many people might raise immediately following 192 about the relative and, we might say, unobjective nature of our sensation. Because something that, say, a moralist might bring up in response to this is, well, how do we know the difference between dreams and real life? And Nietzsche's saying, or like, how can you say then, if all of our experiences are simply indelibly shaped by our own thought patterns and, reinterpreted, falsified, as we've said, then wouldn't the value of our experiences and dreams be just as much as our, quote, actual experiences? And Nietzsche says, yes. Yes, they would. He leans right into it and says, yeah, that is the consequence of what I'm arguing here. And it's true, right? Psychologically, it is true that if you were to have, or we can imagine the inverse of somebody was living on the streets or in prison or whatever, but they have this experience every night when they dream they're, this free-spirited, flying, happy individual. That could also be that could completely alter their experience of life in the world as well. And so this passage, even though it's a bit obscure, I would say, especially if you were to take it out of context with the rest of the book, I think in context with the broader project of Beyond Good and Evil is actually very fascinating and raises a lot of interesting points. All right, let's move on to 194. Quote, "The difference among men becomes manifest not only in the difference between their tablets of goods, in the fact that they consider different goods worth striving for, and also disagree about what is more and less valuable, about the order of rank of the goods they recognize in common. It becomes manifest even more in what they take for really having and possessing something good. Regarding a woman, for example, those men who are more modest consider the mere use of the body and sexual gratification a sufficient and satisfying sign of having, of possession. Another type, with a more suspicious and demanding thirst for possession, sees the question mark, the illusory quality of such having, and wants subtler tests, above all, in order to know whether the woman does not only give herself to him, but also gives up for his sake what she has or would like to have. Only then, does she seem to him possessed. A third type, however, does not reach the end of his mistrust and desire for having even so. He asks himself whether the woman, when she gives up everything for him, does not possibly do this for a phantom of him. He wants to be known deep down, abysmally deep down, before he is capable of being loved at all. He dares to let himself be fathomed. He feels that his beloved is fully in his possession only when she no longer deceives herself about him, when she loves him just as much for his devilry and hidden insatiability as for his graciousness, patience, and spirituality. One type wants to possess a people, and all the higher arts of a Cagliostro and Catiline suit him to that purpose. Someone else with a more subtle thirst for possession says to himself, one may not deceive where one wants to possess. The idea that a mask of him might command the heart of the people irritates him and makes him impatient. So I must let myself be known, and first must know myself. Among helpful and charitable people, one almost regularly encounters that clumsy ruse which first doctors the person to be helped, as if, for example, he deserved help, required just their help, and would prove to be profoundly grateful for all help, faithful and submissive. With these fancies they dispose of the needy as of possessions, being charitable and helpful people from a desire for possessions. One finds them jealous if one crosses or anticipates them when they want to help. Involuntarily, parents turn children into something similar to themselves. They call that education. Deep in her heart, no mother doubts that the child she has born is her property. No father contests his own right to subject it to his concepts and valuations. Indeed, formerly, it seemed fair for fathers, among the ancient Germans, for example, to decide on the life or death of the newborn as they saw fit. And like the father, teachers, classes, priests, and princes still see, even today, in every new human being, an unproblematic opportunity for another possession. So it follows, and, end quote, the line ends with a dash there. This passage, I went ahead and read the whole thing, even though it's rather long, because there isn't terribly much here that I think bears explaining. It's just worth examining again what Nietzsche is doing. That he's talking about, what does he start out? He talks about, at the beginning, of possessing women and different types of men and how what would qualify for them, or what would satisfy that desire in them to possess a woman, and the lengths to which some of them will go. And that one person is satisfied with, we might say the standard, stereotypical, virtuous wife, right? And who regards him as this heroic man who's gracious and patient and a godly man, and so on and so forth. Versus the other type of man who thinks that the most extreme opposite case, the man who thinks that she's only possessed if she loves him for his, as Nietzsche puts it, his devilry, right? Everything that is evil in him. In the way that Nietzsche says in one of those aphorisms that the best eons or epochs in our life can occur when we rechristen in ourselves what is evil as what is best in us. That he wants, the soul in German is feminine, right? And so the man's, to put it in Jungian archetypal terms, the man's anima that he projects onto his wife, he wants her, his soul, so to speak, that he's projected on the external world, to rechristen in him all as evil as what is best in him. That kind of man will only be satisfied with that level of possession, as Nietzsche puts it. But then he goes on to talk about people wishing to possess the heart of an entire people. He mentions Catiline. Nietzsche's view of the whole Catiline conspiracy in ancient Rome is probably influenced by what Michael Parenti would call a gentleman's history, but suffice to say that Catiline is used here as an example of a demagogue. And the idea of helpful and charitable people, even this is an attempt at gaining possessions over things. Parents and their children. The children are, no one doubts that they are the property of their parents. And that, it's often said that people are trying to grasp at immortality. I mean, this is one of the claims of the symposium, right? That people are grasping at immortality through procreation. And that this is part of the reason why the father considers it his right to simply try to upload the contents of his own mind into his son's mind, to reshape his son's mind in the image of his own, so that he possesses all of his own concepts and valuations, as Nietzsche puts it. And so so we could make a comment first about the selfless, charitable person. That would be rather obvious, right? That this goes back to the breakdown of opposite essential categories. That the charitable person is not acting out of selflessness, or rather, to the extent that he is acting out of selflessness, there is a selfishness at base which is motivating that selflessness. That there is a power in helping others. There's an experience of power. It was that line from House of Cards. Generosity is a form of power. And this is why they get jealous if you interfere when they're trying to help. Because they're... But I think the more profound point that is brought out by all of these individual examples is the illiberal, tyrannizing aspect of any drive that Nietzsche's been pointing at throughout this whole division of the text. That this desire to possess, the way that he's describing marriage here and love is this very... when it's strong and infatuatory, or I'm not sure if that's a word, but love has this possessive, obsessive, scary quality to it that we don't always like to acknowledge, because we believe in this sort of Christian idea of love that has been spiritualized, right, during the domination of the European psyche by Christendom. That's sort of distorted or deceived us as to what love really is, but that it is a very... tyrannical impulse. I mean, it's like the tyrannical impulse par excellence. And this even applies to the way we regard our own children as being akin to our own possessions. And in some sense, and then Nietzsche also gives the examples of this possessiveness in the form of, like, we might say, common everyday morality or in politics. And so he concludes the passage, the father, teachers, classes, priests, and princes, they see in every human being an unproblematic opportunity for another possession. And so it follows, and then he leaves off the end quote, right? What follows? Nietzsche loves to do this in Beyond Good and Evil, I think more so than any other work, leave you hanging, because he wants you to think and do the extra legwork yourself. Now, he is he is still manipulating you, right? Or he wants you to think along the lines that he has pushed you to think in throughout this work. So it's not like he's just Nietzsche does have his agenda. He's perhaps the only philosopher, though, he would argue, up to this point, the only one hitherto who has been honest about the fact that he does have an agenda, right? That doesn't mean that the fact that he points out how there's an agenda behind all philosophy, usually an unconscious one, but an agenda nonetheless, doesn't mean that he is free of them. I mean, I know we've covered this point already in past readings, but it's just worth reminding ourselves. So I'm not trying to suggest when I say that Nietzsche is just trying to make us think that it's just this, this completely unself-interested attempt in developing our critical thinking skills. He is trying to make his point. But, and so I am doing you a disservice when I just, crack all these nuts for you, but it's modern times. People don't have time to read books like this and think, so that's why you're listening to this in an audio format. I believe, and this is open to debate, that it follows is that morality itself is the act of attempting to possess, which does follow from the other considerations in previous aphorisms that we've looked at, that it is a tyrannical impulse given expression in the conscious realm. That's what morality is. And so in all of these ways that we might regard selfless or pure or, just totally virtuous action as being the norm, love, marriage, child rearing, charity, or, there's not so much of this type of naive idealism anymore, but maybe some existed back in the day. The statesman who only cares for the good, the well-being of his people. And all of these, an impulse is active, attempting to gain possession over something else. And I think, again, this individual passage doesn't contain much philosophical bits to chew on. It's just when you really take in the full implications of what Nietzsche's method is in analyzing all of these human actions and what they really mean, it's rather profound. All right, let's go to 195. Quote, "The Jews, a people born for slavery, as Tacitus and the whole ancient world say. The chosen people among the peoples, as they themselves say and believe. The Jews have brought off that miraculous feat of an inversion in values, thanks to which life on earth has acquired a novel and dangerous attraction for a couple of millennia. Their prophets have fused rich, godless, evil, violent, and sensual into one, and were the first to use the word world as an opprobrium. The inversion of values, which includes using the word poor as synonymous with holy and friend, constitutes the significance of the Jewish people. They mark the beginning of the slave rebellion in morals," end quote. And, this is the kind of passage that when they were doing early, Third Reich compilations of Nietzsche's opinions on the Jews, they would pluck, they would even take this passage and expurgate it and edit it down so that it was, perhaps even more forceful or misrepresented in some ways, less balanced than it already is, and then just presented out of context, right? But if we set all that aside, all the opportunities that somebody might have, an anti-Semite might have with this passage for, bolstering their own beliefs, what is Nietzsche actually saying? Well, it's the point that he elaborates on in Genealogy of Morality, of the slave revolt in morality. The important things being not so much the Jews here, but like using them as a lens to look into the origins of this slave revolt. The regarding of the world as something which must be rejected and transcended. And then, what does he say? Rich, godless, evil, violent, sensual. These are formed into one image. And that is the image that the slave moralist has of the master, right? They define evil as the primary thing, first and foremost. They're concerned with designating what is harmful to them because it's a morality based on fear. And that is the master who, at the time of the slave revolt and morality reaching its full fever pitch in the figure of Jesus, that is like the Roman aristocrat, right? And according to that moral system, they are the most sensuous, richest, and powerful people are the most evil, indeed. And then the poor, blessed are the poor in spirit, the poor become the holy people. And we've sort of discussed this already. And so that really is the significance of this passage. It's not really, I don't think there's terribly much here for sussing out Nietzsche's opinions on the Jews. If anything, if you want more elaboration on this, you can go listen to the episode on genealogy of morality. It's why he says that Judea ultimately conquered Rome, because the slave moralistic perspective that is ultimately inherited from the Jews, the first people to make this revaluation of the world, reaches its full apotheosis, for lack of a better word, or perhaps because it is the best word, in Jesus Christ. And this is what ultimately conquers the hearts of the Romans, right? Even though they don't physically conquer them and, using physical force in the actual physical conflict or anything like that. And so this is another passage that I think, considering that we've already kind of covered the master-slave morality dichotomy as it's brought up in that text in Genealogy of Morality, it's sort of already been elaborated upon in the course of the podcast. But again, at the time of the publication of Beyond Good and Evil, this passage here, 195, is it's one of those statements that Nietzsche made that he felt needed to be elaborated upon, which is why he writes Genealogy of Morality in the first place, in order to take this idea of the master and slave morality, which is roughly sketched out here. I mean, really, you have like a really good summary of what the slave morality is just in this paragraph, and he goes on and develops that later. We're going to look at just one more passage this week, which means no, we're not going to get through this whole section. I was kind of thinking earlier we might be able to do one, chapter per episode from here on out, but we're not going to be able to give all the aphorisms really the care that they deserve if we do that, so that's not going to happen. I was just kind of thinking in the interest of like time for the podcast broadly, right? Like that when all's said and done, however many weeks, is going to be like months of just covering Beyond Good and Evil. But it's a deep, deep book. And if we're going to walk through and analyze the entire thing, we've got to do it right. So with that being said, we'll look at one final aphorism for this week. 196, quote, "Countless dark bodies are to be inferred besides the sun, and we shall never see them. Among ourselves this is a parable, and a psychologist of morals reads the whole writing of the stars only as a parable and sign language, which can be used to bury much in silence." End quote. And so, as to what Nietzsche's talking about, most of us now in modern times are familiar with the idea of dark matter. That's what Nietzsche's bringing up. I mean, he says, countless dark bodies are to be inferred besides the sun, right? So he kind of is like placing it within the solar system, but on the galactic or even on the level of the entire universe, astronomers have figured out that it's like 98% of the matter that is out there we can't see, just based on the gravitational movement of the planets. It can't all be explained, leading them to infer that there is matter out there, that it's just of the nature that it doesn't reflect light or is just otherwise not perceptible to us in some way. That it can be inferred from the math and from what we have observed, but we don't have the direct sensory perception of it. It's not actual empirical evidence, right? Because empirical evidence it's direct sensory evidence. Things that you have to infer, well, that's a conclusion that you're drawing. So it becomes a matter of interpretation in some sense. And this is the world that morality exists in. Again, Nietzsche has drawn this link between our tyrannizing impulses and morality as it is expressed. Morality is simply the bursting of that into the world of conscious intellection. But Nietzsche is reminding us that this very world of conscious intellection that we're all engaging in right now, and to analyze morality, to set forth on our science of morals via the psychological method that Nietzsche's setting out upon here, that this is only a parable and sign language. So we're looking, in some sense, at what is being shown at the surface and skin, what appears, which the strange thing, again, about Nietzsche's rejection of true worlds and insistence on only living in this phenomenal world, in this world as it appears, the apparent world, is the knowledge that we have that what appears can be a mask and can conceal a great deal more than what is shown, that what is shown is necessarily also a concealment. And so, among ourselves, us free spirits, us embarking upon the science of morality, the idea of dark matter is a parable that we have to always keep in mind in our study of all things moral and attempting this natural history of morals. That we read the whole writing of the stars, so we read the whole writing of the self, the psyche, our moral universe, our valuations, only within this world of signs and signifiers, which are all masks that reveal something to us, but conceal a great deal more. Again, that, you could have 98% of the matter unperceived, right? And only perceive 2% of it and have to infer the rest. And that doesn't mean you can't therefore make valid inferences. It just means that much of this real world, things that are real insofar as they can affect us and our experience, right? What we might call the workings of nature, the patterns of nature, even if we don't perceive them, right? In reclaiming the world as just being the apparent world of our own perception, Nietzsche isn't saying that what you can't see isn't there, because that would be, for one, that would just be silly. But no, it's very much there and it's very much real. It's just that for, the vast majority, the lion's share of reality, as far as your engagement with it, you are just grasping in the dark. And you have to proceed by inference and by means of these signs and falsifications that we've made in order to grasp the world at all. That's the situation that we're in. And that's why this is so tough, developing a natural history of morals, that this is the human condition and the nature of our perception, and it is just that much easier to remain in what is, the familiar falsifications, the conventional falsifications, to hold on to the moral sentiments that are so near and dear to us that we almost just can't even imagine the world without them. But, all right, I think that covers it. So, with all that being said, we'll definitely be able to, I think, finish out this section next week and then get into at least a little bit of part 6, We Scholars. So that should be rather exciting. By the time you're listening to this, I believe I'll be in Oklahoma City tonight. And we'll have just driven from Denver to Lawrence, Kansas, and then we'll be in Tulsa the next day. So I'll be on tour when these episodes are coming out. So I'm very excited about this. It's my first ever tour with the new band. It's just regional touring, but it's a solid week and a half, and then we have another weekend after that, after we get back. And I think a lot of the shows are going to be pretty good. I'm very hopeful about it. A lot of the people, the bands that we've, and the venues we've partnered with on this tour are very excited about it as much as we are. And I just want to get out there on the road again and, live that life, be traveling from city to city. There's just nothing like it. I love it. And all right, so that's going to be it for this week, everybody. Hope you're enjoying our long-winded deep dive into Beyond Good and Evil. I certainly am. And with that, I will see you all next time. Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.